Alarms scream through the corridor before I even open my eyes. I am Drevik Selane, sensor officer aboard the Coalition cruiser Ashen Vigil, and the first thing I understand as I wake is that we are dying. Smoke fills the lower deck. Red light pulses across every panel in my station, and my hands move before my mind catches up, slapping controls that used to respond in an instant and now stutter under the strain of a hull that has taken far more damage than it was built to survive. Somewhere behind me, a support beam gives way with a groan that I feel in my teeth more than hear with my ears. We were not supposed to be here. This patrol route was marked calm on every chart, a quiet stretch of space between two mining colonies where nothing worse than smugglers ever showed up. Then the raiders came out of nowhere, 3 ships bristling with weapons that did not match any registry we carried, and within minutes half our defensive grid was gone. My commanding officer, a hardened Shrath named Vashtor Kell, stands at the center of the bridge, with his claws gripping the edge of his console so tightly that the metal has started to bend. He does not shout. Shrath officers rarely shout, but the stillness in his voice is somehow worse than any scream could be. "Report," he says, and I realize the word is aimed at me. "Hull integrity at 40% and falling," I say, forcing my voice to stay level, even as another impact rocks the ship sideways. "Weapons array offline on the port side. Life support holding, but barely. And the raiders?" I check the readout again, hoping the numbers have changed for the better. They have not. Still closing. All 3 of them. "We cannot outrun this, sir." Vashtor does not respond right away. I watch him calculate, the way every Shrath officer is trained to calculate, weighing losses against gains, searching for the angle that keeps the most of us alive. It is a good system. It has kept the Coalition standing for longer than my own species has kept written records. But right now, in this moment, I do not think there is an angle left to find. "Send the distress signal," he finally says. "Full band, unencrypted, every frequency we have access to. If anyone out here can hear us, let them hear us." I do not point out what everyone on the bridge already knows. This sector is far from any Coalition patrol route. The nearest Shrath fleet is days away at full burn. The nearest anything friendly is days away. Sending the signal is less a plan and more a way of saying goodbye with dignity, a last transmission into the dark in case someone, someday, finds our wreckage and wants to know what happened to us. I send it anyway. My claws move across the console, encoding our position, our situation, the number of crew still alive, everything a rescue party would need if a rescue party ever came. Then, I sit back and wait for nothing, because nothing is what I expect. The raiders fire again. This time the shot lands closer, and the whole ship lurches, throwing 2 crew members out of their harnesses and into the bulkhead. I grip my own console until the shaking stops, until I can trust my legs to hold me if I try to stand. "Time until they are in boarding range?" Vashtor asks. 6 minutes, I say. Maybe less. 6 minutes. I have served on this ship for 4 years. I know every officer on this bridge by name, by the small habits that make them who they are, by the jokes they tell when the shifts run long and the stars outside the viewport start to blur together into something almost peaceful. 6 minutes does not feel like enough time to say goodbye to any of it. Then my console chirps. It is a small sound, almost lost beneath the groan of the dying ship around us, but I hear it instantly because it is not a sound I expected to hear again. An incoming transmission, not the raiders taunting us, not another Coalition ship too far away to help. Something new. I pull the signal onto the main display, and the words that appear there make my breath catch, in a way that has nothing to do with the smoke filling the room. "This is the Widow's Reach. We have received your distress call. Hold your position. We are coming." For a moment, nobody on the bridge speaks. I look up at Vashtor, and even his composed expression flickers, just slightly, into something I can only describe as confusion. "Identify that vessel," he orders. I run the query, cross-referencing every registry the Coalition keeps, every Allied fleet list, every neutral trading vessel on record within 100 light-years. The answer comes back strange, unfamiliar, and somehow both smaller and larger than I expected. "It is human," I say. "A single vessel, no escort, no Coalition designation on file." Vashtor's expression hardens again, But this time I can read the doubt underneath it clearly. Humans are not a species anyone in this sector takes seriously as a military power. 3 systems, barely settled, no long-standing treaties with the coalition beyond a handful of trade agreements, signed out of politeness rather than necessity. I have heard other officers describe them the way you might describe a young species still finding its feet, capable of trade and conversation, but not yet capable of standing shoulder to shoulder with fleets that have fought wars for 1,000 years. 1 ship, Vashtor repeats, and there is something almost like disbelief in the words. 1 human ship against 3 raiders that have already crippled us. That is what the signal says, I confirm. He turns back to the viewport, staring out into the dark where nothing is visible yet, where the promised rescue is still too far away to see with the naked eye. I understand his hesitation. I share it. A single vessel with no support, arriving to face down 3 armed raiders who have already proven willing to fire without warning, sounds less like a rescue and more like an additional casualty about to happen. But I am the sensor officer. It is my job to watch, not to judge, and so I keep my station and I keep watching, even as the raiders continue their approach, and the seconds tick away toward the 6 minutes I calculated only moments before. 3 minutes pass. The raiders fire twice more, testing our remaining defenses, probing for the weakness that will let them finish this quickly. I redirect what little power we have left into the shields, buying us moments instead of minutes, and I try not to think about what happens when even those moments run out. Then my console lights up again, and this time it is not a message, it is a contact. I have something, I say, and every head on the bridge turns toward me. New vessel, entering the outer edge of our sensor range, matching the transponder from the transmission. Configuration? Vashtor asks. I pull up everything my instruments can gather, and even as the data populates across my screen, I find myself struggling to make sense of it. The ship is long, narrow, built along lines that remind me more of a blade than any coalition warship I have studied. Its hull plating is thick, thicker than anything I would expect on a vessel that size, as though the engineers who built it cared more about surviving impacts than avoiding them in the first place. Weapons signature? Vashtor presses. Minimal, I say, and I hear the confusion creeping into my own voice. I am reading almost no active weapons systems, no targeting arrays extended, no charge buildup in anything resembling a long-range cannon. For a species approaching 3 armed raiders, this makes no sense to me. Every doctrine I have ever studied, every tactical simulation the Coalition academies drilled into me during my training, agrees on one basic truth: distance is safety. The side that can strike first from the greatest range wins the engagement before it truly begins. It is why Shrath ships bristle with plasma lances built to reach across thousands of kilometers, why every Coalition vessel I have ever served on treats range superiority as the single most important factor in any confrontation. A ship without long-range weapons approaching an armed enemy should be a ship already defeated. And yet the human vessel keeps closing, its engines burning steady and sure, its course locked directly toward the raiders without the slightest deviation. They are not slowing down, I say, half to Vashtor and half to myself, because I need to hear the words out loud to believe them. Sir, they are not even attempting to decelerate into a standard engagement pattern. Vashtor studies the display over my shoulder, his claws tapping once against the edge of my console. A habit I have learned means he is thinking harder than he wants to show. Perhaps their sensors have not registered the raiders yet. They received our distress call, I remind him. They know exactly what they are flying toward. He does not answer that. There is nothing comfortable to say in response, and we both know it. I watch the human vessel's approach vector update in real time, watch the numbers shift as it eats up the distance between itself and the 3 raiders far faster than any cautious commander should allow, and a small, cold feeling starts to build in my chest that has nothing to do with the smoke still drifting through the bridge around us. They must have a plan, says Yeren, our tactical officer, from her station near the front of the bridge. She sounds like she is trying to convince herself as much as anyone else. No one flies straight at 3 armed ships without a reason, unless they do not understand what they are facing, Vashtor says quietly. I want to agree with him. It would be easier to agree with him, But something about the way that ship moves, the steadiness of its course, the complete absence of hesitation in its burn pattern, tells me this is not a mistake born of ignorance. Whoever is flying that vessel knows precisely what waits ahead of them, and they are choosing to close the distance anyway. The raiders noticed the new arrival almost as quickly as I did. I watched their formation shift on my display, 2 of the 3 peeling away from their attack on us to address this unexpected guest, their own weapons already charging, already tracking, ready to demonstrate exactly why range has always been the deciding factor in every engagement I have ever studied. "They are opening fire," Yaren reports, her voice tight. I brace myself for the human vessel to break formation, to scatter, to do anything a reasonable commander would do when facing incoming fire from a superior range. Instead, the readings hold steady. The ship continues forward, absorbing the first volley without so much as a course correction, its shields flaring bright against the impact, and then settling back into place, as though the strike had barely registered at all. "Hull integrity report on the human vessel," Vashtor orders. I do not have detailed enough sensors to say for certain, I admit, but based on the flare pattern, their shields held. No visible damage to the hull. Vashtor says nothing, and I understand why. None of us have an answer for what we are watching. A single ship, without the long-range weapons that every doctrine in known space treats as the foundation of survival, is walking directly into concentrated fire from 3 separate hostile vessels, and it is not breaking. It is not slowing. It is not doing anything except getting closer. I glance at the timer still ticking down in the corner of my display, the one I set earlier to track how long until the raiders reach boarding range on our own crippled ship. 4 minutes remain. 4 minutes until the raiders that have not turned their attention away from us finish what they started, unless something changes first. I look back at the human vessel's approach vector, at the weapons system still showing minimal activation, at the strange, patient way it continues forward despite everything logic tells me it should be doing differently. Whatever plan lies behind that approach, whatever strategy could possibly justify closing distance against an enemy with a clear range advantage, I do not understand it yet. But I am starting to suspect, with a chill that has nothing to do with the temperature on the bridge, that I am about to. The timer in the corner of my display drops to 3 minutes, and I force myself to stop watching it, because staring at falling numbers will not make them fall any slower. Instead, I turn my full attention back to the human vessel, trying to understand what I am looking at, because nothing about it fits inside the frameworks I was trained to use. Every weapons doctrine I studied at the academy begins with the same principle. Distance wins engagements. A ship that can strike an enemy from far away, before that enemy can strike back, holds every advantage that matters. This is why Shrath shipwrights spend generations refining plasma lance technology, stretching effective range further with each new design, because a longer reach means fewer moments of real danger. This is why coalition tactical training drills range management into every cadet until it becomes instinct rather than thought. Get close to an enemy, and you invite disaster. Stay far away, and you control the fight. The 3 raiders bearing down on us clearly follow the same logic. Their weapons flare from a comfortable distance, striking without ever coming near enough for a return volley to matter. It is the pattern I expect, the pattern every engagement I have witnessed in 4 years of service has followed. Predictable, sound, safe, at least for the side holding the range advantage. The human vessel breaks that pattern entirely, and the more I study it, the less sense it makes. Weapons status on the human ship, updated, I say, mostly to keep my voice steady rather than because Vashtor asked for another report. Still no long-range systems active. Their forward emitters remain retracted. Retracted, Vashtor repeats, and for the first time since this crisis began, I hear something in his voice that might be genuine surprise. They are approaching an active engagement with their weapons stowed. Perhaps they intend to negotiate, offers Yaren from the tactical station, though even she does not sound convinced by her own suggestion. Negotiation seems an unlikely goal for a ship absorbing direct fire without response. I check the raiders' targeting data again, cross-referencing it with what little history the coalition holds on this particular group. They are not opportunists. Sensor logs from 3 previous encounters, filed by different coalition patrols over the last several years, describe a pattern of calculated, disciplined engagement, always retreating the moment the numbers turn against them, never lingering to fight a battle they might lose. This is not a group that panics under pressure. If the human ship's approach were truly reckless, truly suicidal, the raiders would have already adjusted their formation to exploit it. Instead, I notice something strange. 2 of the 3 raider vessels have shifted their firing pattern, spreading their volleys wider, as though trying to find a rhythm that will actually slow the human ship down, rather than simply testing its defenses. It is not working. The human vessel's course remains a straight, unbroken line toward the heart of the raider formation, and its speed, if anything, appears to be increasing rather than dropping away. Its behavior does not match caution, I say slowly, working through the thought as I speak it aloud. But it also does not match recklessness. There is something deliberate about how it is closing distance, as if the distance itself is the objective, not something to be avoided. Vashtor turns from the viewport to look at me directly, and for the first time in the years I have served under him, I see genuine uncertainty in his expression, rather than the calm, calculating mask he usually wears. Explain. I gather my thoughts, trying to put words to an instinct I do not fully understand myself yet. Every combat doctrine I have studied treats range as an asset to be maximized. Every ship we have ever engaged, friendly or hostile, behaves as though distance equals safety. This vessel is behaving as though distance is something to be spent, not saved. It is burning through the gap between itself and the raiders as quickly as its engines allow, absorbing fire along the way without any attempt to return it. That is not tactics, Vashtor says. That is surrender with extra steps. I want to agree, and a part of me almost does. But something about the calm, mechanical steadiness of the human ship's approach refuses to let the thought settle. A vessel intending to surrender does not maintain a locked course directly toward the most heavily armed enemy in the engagement. A vessel intending to surrender slows down, raises hands metaphorically, signals its intent clearly, rather than continuing to absorb hostile fire without complaint. This ship is doing none of that. It is simply closing the distance, patiently, deliberately, as though the outcome of doing so is already decided in its favor. The raiders fire again, a coordinated volley from all 3 vessels at once, and for a moment, I brace myself for the readings to finally show damage, some crack in the human ship's shields, some sign that the approach has finally cost them something. Instead, the flare pattern registers across my display exactly as it did before, bright and brief, and then gone, the ship's course unchanged beneath it. Their shields are not degrading, I report, and I can hear the strain of disbelief in my own voice now. Sir, they have absorbed 4 direct volleys from 3 separate vessels, and their shield strength shows no measurable decline. Vashtor's claws tighten again on the edge of the console beside him. What technology are they running? I do not know, I admit. Nothing in our records describes shielding of this capacity for a vessel this size. The timer in the corner of my display drops below 2 minutes, the countdown toward our own destruction ticking forward, regardless of whatever strange miracle is unfolding out beyond the viewport. I force myself to check our own status again, and the news there is no better than before. Hull integrity continuing to fail. Life support strained past comfortable limits. 3 separate fires still burning somewhere below decks that our damage control teams have not yet managed to contain. If they intend to help us, Yaren says, her voice tight with the same urgency I feel building in my own chest, they need to reach us before that timer expires. I run the calculation again, comparing the human vessel's closing speed against the distance still separating it from the raiders, and then against the distance separating the raiders from us. The numbers do not offer much comfort. Even at its current speed, the human ship will not close with the raider formation until roughly the same moment the raiders would otherwise be closing with us. Whatever is about to happen, it is going to happen fast, and it is going to happen close, with almost no room left for anyone to adjust their plans once the moment arrives. Their weapons ports, I say suddenly, noticing a change in the readout that catches my attention. Sir, look. Vashtor leans toward my display, and Yaren abandons her own station briefly to look as well. On the human vessel's hull, previously smooth and unbroken along its flanks, several sections have begun to shift, panels sliding open to reveal openings that were not visible moments before. I widen the sensor resolution as far as it will go, trying to identify what these openings might contain, but the readings remain frustratingly vague, distorted by some kind of shielding I do not recognize, that seems designed specifically to obscure exactly this sort of scan. Cannons? Yeren asks. I cannot confirm that, I say. The openings do not match the profile of any long-range weapon system I have on file. If anything, they appear smaller, shorter-barreled, positioned close together in clusters, rather than spread, for wide area coverage. Vashtor studies the display for a long moment before speaking again, and when he does, his voice carries a weight I have not heard from him before. Not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it. The sound of a man recalculating everything he thought he understood about the battle unfolding in front of him. Short-range weapons, deployed only once the vessel has closed nearly all the distance to its target. A ship built to absorb punishment rather than avoid it, closing deliberately with an enemy who believes distance guarantees safety. I feel the same realization settling over me as the words leave his mouth, cold and heavy and impossible to dismiss now that it has been spoken aloud. Every principle I was ever taught insists that the side holding range superiority controls an engagement, but control only matters if the other side respects the same rules. If this human vessel has been built from its very foundation around a different philosophy entirely, one that treats closing the gap as the true objective, rather than something to be avoided at all costs, then everything the raiders believe about their own safety may be about to prove catastrophically wrong. 1 minute until the raiders reach effective range for boarding action against us, Yeren reports, her voice clipped and tense. And the human vessel? Vashtor asks, though I suspect he already knows the answer before I give it. I check the closing distance one final time, watching the gap between the human ship and the raider formation shrink toward a threshold my instruments were never designed to consider tactically significant, a range so close that it falls beneath the minimum engagement distance built into every coalition weapon simulation I have ever run. 30 seconds, I say, maybe less. Nobody on the bridge speaks after that. We simply watch, the three of us, and everyone else still conscious and at their stations, as the gap between hunter and prey collapses toward nothing, and whatever the human vessel has been built to do at exactly this range prepares, at last, to reveal itself. The gap closes to nothing in the space of a single held breath, and then everything changes at once. The human vessel does not slow as it reaches the raider formation. If anything, it accelerates through the final stretch of open space, and the moment its hull crosses whatever invisible line its systems have been waiting for, every one of those strange openings along its flanks comes alive together. I watch on my display as dozens of small, fast projectiles streak outward. Not the wide, sweeping beams I would expect from a long-range cannon, but tight, concentrated bursts that strike with a precision that makes my breath catch in my throat. Report, Vashtor says, and I can hear that even he is struggling to keep his voice even now. Direct hits along the lead raider's hull, I say, watching the readings scroll faster than I can fully absorb them. Their shields are down. I am reading multiple hull breaches. How is that possible? Yeren asks, disbelief plain in her voice. Their shields were holding against our own vessel's fire only minutes ago. I run the numbers again, comparing shield strength readings from before the human ship's arrival against what I am seeing now, and the answer that emerges chills me more than anything else I have witnessed since this crisis began. Their shields were built to hold against sustained fire from a distance. They were never designed to withstand concentrated impact at point-blank range. The human vessel is not firing through their shields. It is exploiting a gap in what those shields were ever meant to stop. Vashtor is silent for a long moment, watching the raider formations scatter in confusion on the display, their disciplined pattern breaking apart as each vessel tries to react to a threat none of them prepared for. They built their defenses the same way everyone in this sector builds their defenses, he finally says, to survive an exchange at range, not this. I do not answer, because there is nothing to say that would improve on the simple, terrible truth of his observation. Every ship in known space, coalition and raider alike, has been engineered around the same shared assumption, the same doctrine drilled into every shipbuilder and every academy cadet since the first coalition fleets took to the stars. Keep your distance. Strike first. Let range decide the outcome before the enemy ever gets close enough to matter. The raiders followed that doctrine as faithfully as anyone, and it has left them completely unprepared for an enemy who refused to play by its rules from the very first moment of contact. On my display, something new detaches from the human vessel's hull, smaller than the projectiles that struck first, moving with a controlled, purposeful trajectory toward the breach already opened in the lead raider's side. "What is that?" Yaren asks, leaning closer to my station. "I believe it is some form of boarding craft," I say, watching the object's heat signature and structural readings resolve as it closes the final distance. Small, heavily reinforced, moving directly toward the breach in the enemy hull. "They intend to board an active hostile vessel," Vashtor says, and there is something in his voice now that sounds almost like awe, layered over disbelief. In the middle of an engagement, with 2 other hostile ships still active nearby. I watch the small craft strike home, magnetic clamps engaging against the raider's hull, with a precision that leaves no room for chance, and then the readings from inside the enemy vessel begin to shift in ways that tell me more than any visual feed could. Internal power fluctuations, sudden drops in weapons charge across multiple systems, the unmistakable signature of a ship's own defenses being disabled from within, rather than destroyed from without. "Their weapons are going offline," I report, unable to keep the disbelief from creeping into my own voice now. "Not damaged, disabled. Someone is shutting them down from inside the hull." The second and third raider vessels, watching their lead ship fall silent within moments of contact, finally break their formation entirely, peeling away in opposite directions in what I recognize immediately as a retreat maneuver, the same calculated withdrawal pattern their recorded history describes them using whenever an engagement turns against them. It is the correct response, according to every doctrine I know. Disengage before the cost outweighs the gain. Preserve the fleet rather than risk total loss. The human vessel does not allow it. I watch, transfixed, as its engines flare and its course shifts with a speed that should not be possible for a ship its size, curving to intercept the second raider's retreat vector before the gap between them can widen past a certain threshold. It is a maneuver built entirely around denying an enemy the one option every combat doctrine I know treats as sacred: the ability to simply leave once the fight turns unfavorable. "They are matching its retreat," I say, "not letting the distance grow." "That is not how engagements end," Yaren says, and I hear something close to genuine distress in her voice now. The sound of a trained tactical officer watching every assumption she has ever built her expertise around come apart in real time. A losing vessel disengages. The winning side lets them go, rather than risk overextension. That is the entire logic of range warfare. "This vessel does not appear to be operating under that logic," I say quietly. The second raider's engines flare brighter, clearly attempting to outrun the pursuit, and for a moment, I allow myself to hope that perhaps this is where the human vessel's advantage finally runs out. Perhaps sheer speed will let the raider escape where close-range weapons cannot follow. But the gap between the 2 ships does not widen. If anything, it continues to shrink, slowly but steadily, the human vessel's engines burning with a sustained intensity that suggests it was built from the outset, never to lose a pursuit once it had chosen to begin one. Another cluster of projectiles streaks from the human ship's hull, striking the fleeing raider's engines directly, and I watch the readings on its propulsion system collapse from full output to near nothing in the span of a few seconds. The ship does not explode. It does not suffer catastrophic hull failure. It simply stops, drifting now rather than fleeing, its ability to run taken from it as precisely and deliberately as its weapons were taken from the first vessel boarded only moments before. "They are disabling rather than destroying," I say, watching the pattern repeat with a clarity that finally lets me understand what I am truly witnessing. Every strike so far has targeted systems, not the crew compartments themselves. Weapons, engines, shield generators. Nothing aimed at the sections of the hull where the raiders themselves would be sheltering. Vashtor says nothing for a long moment, and when I glance at him, I find an expression on his face that I have never seen there before, something caught between disbelief and a grudging, unwilling respect. "They are not trying to kill everyone aboard those ships," he finally says. "They are trying to take them." The third raider, watching both of its companions fall silent and helpless within the span of a few short minutes, makes a final desperate attempt to break away entirely, engines burning at a rate that surely strains every safety limit the vessel was built to endure. I watch the human ship respond, not with panic, not with any hint of urgency, but with the same steady, unbroken confidence it has carried since the very first moment it appeared on my sensors. The timer in the corner of my display, the one counting down toward our own destruction, has stopped entirely. I realize with a start that it stopped several minutes ago. The raiders that had been closing on us, abandoning their approach the moment their companions came under attack, redirecting every available resource toward a threat that has already proven itself far more dangerous than the crippled coalition cruiser they had been circling like scavengers moments before. We are, for the first time since this crisis began, no longer the primary target of anyone in this engagement. I turn my attention back to the third raider's flight path, watching the gap between it and the human vessel continue its slow, inevitable collapse. And I find myself holding a breath I did not realize I was holding, waiting to see whether this final vessel will manage what the first two could not, or whether it too will discover that the distance it is counting on to save it has already been rendered meaningless by an enemy who never believed in distance as a form of safety in the first place. The third raider does not manage what the first two could not. I watch its engines flare one final time, a desperate burn that briefly widens the gap by a fraction, and for a heartbeat, I let myself believe that perhaps this one vessel will slip free where its companions failed. Then the human ship adjusts its own course with a smoothness that suggests the maneuver was calculated well in advance, cutting across the raider's escape vector at an angle that should not have been possible given the distances and speeds involved only moments before. They anticipated the turn, I say, more to myself than to anyone else on the bridge, because I need to say it aloud to believe it. Sir, they predicted that vector before the raider committed to it. Vashtor does not answer right away. He is watching the display with an intensity I have rarely seen from him, the same focus he usually reserves for the most dangerous moments of any engagement, except this time the danger is not aimed at us. We have become spectators to something neither of us fully understands yet, and I think some part of him resents that, as much as it fascinates him. The gap closes for the final time, and the human vessel's short-range weapons fire once more, this time targeting the raiders' maneuvering thrusters, with the same precision I watched applied to the second ship's main engines. The readings confirm what I expect, before Yaren even says it aloud. Their propulsion is gone, she reports. They are dead in space. 3 raider vessels, all of them disabled within the span of a few short minutes, none of them destroyed outright. All of them left drifting helplessly in the same stretch of space where they had, only a short while ago, believed themselves to hold every advantage in an engagement against a crippled coalition cruiser with nowhere left to run. I expect the human vessel to withdraw at this point, its objective apparently accomplished, the threat to our own ship neutralized without a single shot fired from our own remaining weapons. Instead, I watch 3 more of those small boarding craft detach from its hull, each one angling toward one of the disabled raiders in turn, moving with the same unhurried confidence that has characterized every action this vessel has taken since it first appeared on my sensors. They are finishing the engagement, Vashtor says quietly, not simply disabling the enemy, taking them. I pull whatever additional sensor resolution I can manage from our damaged systems, trying to get a clearer picture of what is happening aboard the boarding craft themselves, and the images that resolve, grainy and imperfect as they are, tell me more about this human vessel's true nature than anything I have witnessed so far. Inside the small craft closing on the first disabled raider, I count 6 figures, each equipped with gear that looks nothing like the standard coalition combat loadout I have seen in training simulations throughout my career. No long-barreled weapons designed for engaging targets across open corridors or wide compartments. Instead, each figure carries something shorter, more compact, built for close quarters, where a longer weapon would only become a liability rather than an advantage. Their equipment matches their ship, I say, working through the observation as it forms. Everything about this vessel, from its weapons to its boarding craft to whatever those figures are carrying, has been built around the same underlying principle, not to strike from a distance, but to close that distance completely and operate effectively once it has been closed. An entire doctrine built around proximity, Vashtor says, and I hear the weight of the realization settling into his voice as he speaks it. Not simply a single ship designed this way by accident, but every piece of equipment aboard it, reflecting the same philosophy. I check the historical files the Coalition maintains on humanity, searching for anything that might explain where such a philosophy could have originated. And what I find is frustratingly thin. Humans have been part of Coalition space for less than 2 decades. Their contact limited mostly to trade negotiations and the occasional diplomatic exchange. Their military capabilities have never been formally tested against Coalition forces, and the assumption among most officers I have served alongside has always been that a species this new to interstellar contact could not possibly have developed doctrine sophisticated enough to challenge established powers like the Shrath. That assumption, I am beginning to understand with a growing unease, was badly mistaken. The boarding craft reached their targets, magnetic clamps engaging against each disabled raider's hull in turn, and within moments, the same pattern I observed on the first vessel begins to repeat across the second and third. Internal power fluctuations. Weapon systems going dark not from external damage but from something happening within the hull itself. Whatever those boarding teams are doing once they breach a compartment, it is efficient, and it is fast, and it leaves each raider vessel completely neutralized within a span of time that would have been impossible for any Coalition boarding action I have ever studied. Casualties? Vashtor asks, and I understand the question beneath the question. He wants to know whether this human doctrine of closing distance and boarding vessels directly comes at a cost measured in lives, whether the price of denying an enemy the safety of range is paid in blood rather than simply in tactical advantage. I search the sensor data as carefully as our damaged systems allow, looking for any sign of the raider crews themselves, and what I find surprises me more than almost anything else I have witnessed today. The life signs aboard all 3 vessels remain largely intact. Reduced in some sections, certainly, where the boarding teams appear to have encountered resistance, but nothing resembling the widespread loss I would expect from a Coalition boarding action against a hostile crew that had, only minutes before, been actively trying to destroy our own ship. Minimal, I report. The majority of the raider crews appear to be alive, though several individual life signs show signs of restraint or incapacitation rather than loss. Vashtor is quiet for a long moment, processing this along with everything else we have witnessed. They are not trying to destroy this enemy, he finally says. They are trying to take them intact, ship and crew both. I think back to the strange restraint I noticed earlier in the pattern of the human vessel's attacks, the way every strike targeted systems rather than crew compartments, the way even the boarding teams appear to have focused on disabling resistance rather than eliminating it entirely. It is a level of control and precision that seems almost at odds with the raw, overwhelming decisiveness of everything else this vessel has done since it arrived. And yet somehow the two things fit together perfectly once I stopped trying to force them into the framework I was originally trained to expect. This was never simply an act of aggression, I say slowly, understanding settling over me with the same weight I felt when I first realized the Raiders' shields had never been designed to withstand this kind of assault. It was a demonstration, controlled from beginning to end. A demonstration of what? Yaren asks, though something in her tone suggests she already suspects the answer as much as I do. I look back at the display, at the 3 disabled raider vessels drifting silently now, their weapons stripped from them, their crews restrained rather than destroyed, the entire engagement concluded in less time than it would have taken a coalition fleet simply to establish a firing solution at standard range. That distance was never the advantage everyone in this sector has always assumed it to be, I say. Not against an enemy who was never planning to respect it in the first place. Vashtor turns from the viewport, and for the first time since this crisis began, I see something in his expression that I have never associated with him before. Not fear exactly, and not quite the grudging respect I noticed earlier either, but something closer to genuine unease, the look of a commander who has spent his entire career mastering a set of rules, only to watch them dismantled in the span of a single engagement by an opponent who never agreed to play by them at all. If this is what a single vessel can accomplish, he says quietly, I find myself wondering what an entire fleet built along these same principles might be capable of. Neither Yaren nor I have an answer for him. I am not certain anyone in coalition space does yet. All I know, watching the human vessel begin its approach toward our own crippled hull at last, Its objective, with the raiders apparently concluded, is that whatever assumptions I carried into this engagement about the balance of power in known space have been quietly and thoroughly overturned, and I suspect I am not the only one aboard this ship who will carry that unease long after the smoke finally clears from our corridors. While the human vessel closes the distance toward the Ashen Vigil, I find myself pulling every archived file the Coalition holds on humanity, searching for anything that might explain what I have just witnessed. Most of what exists is thin, the kind of surface-level cultural summary compiled by diplomats rather than anyone with military expertise, but buried within one older report, filed by a trade envoy who spent several years living among human settlements before the Coalition established formal contact. I find a passage that stops me cold. The envoy describes, almost in passing, a detail about human history that most Coalition scholars apparently dismissed as irrelevant cultural trivia rather than anything worth studying seriously. For nearly the entire span of their species' existence, long before humans ever developed the technology to leave their own world, they lived on a planet shared with other predators, creatures faster, stronger, and in many cases better equipped for confrontation than humans themselves. Distance never protected them from these threats, the way it protects most species who evolve as the dominant predator on their homeworld. If anything, distance was frequently a disadvantage, giving faster predators time to close in before a human could react at all. I read the passage twice, then a third time, trying to understand its implications fully. Every species I have studied that rose to dominance on its homeworld did so, in one form or another, by controlling distance, by developing the ability to strike or flee before an enemy could close the gap. It is a pattern so universal across Coalition space that no one ever questioned it as the foundation for military doctrine. Range equals survival. It is the first lesson every cadet learns, the assumption baked so deeply into every tactical simulation that questioning it seems almost as strange as questioning gravity. Humans, it seems, never had the luxury of that assumption. If the envoy's account is accurate, an entire species spent the whole of its formative history learning that survival depended not on maintaining distance from danger, but on what happened once that distance had already collapsed to nothing. Cooperation, tools, the ability to turn a moment of vulnerability into a moment of decisive advantage, a completely different set of instincts, built around an entirely different relationship with the concept of range. "You look troubled," Vashtor says, noticing my expression as I set the file aside. "I believe I may understand something about what we witnessed," I say, and I walk him through what the old report describes, watching his expression shift from polite attention to something far more serious, as the implications settle over him, the same way they settled over me. "An entire species that never learned to rely on distance for safety," he says slowly, testing the idea as he speaks it, building their weapons, their ships, their entire military philosophy, around exactly the opposite assumption that every other species in Coalition space has always taken as fundamental truth. "It would explain everything we saw today," I say, "the retracted weapons on approach, the willingness to absorb fire without returning it until the range had closed completely, the precision with which they disabled rather than destroyed. None of it makes sense if you assume they are simply reckless or unprepared. All of it makes perfect sense if you assume they built their entire doctrine around a moment most species spend their whole military tradition trying to avoid." Vashtor is quiet for a long moment, and I can see him running through every engagement report, every intelligence summary, every casual dismissal of human military potential that has passed across his desk during the years he has served as an officer of the Coalition. "We have treated them as a curiosity," he finally says, "a young species, not yet ready to be taken seriously as anything beyond a trading partner. I wonder now how many other officers across the Coalition have made the same assumption." I think of every conversation I have overheard among Coalition officers about humanity over the years I have served aboard this ship, the casual jokes, the polite condescension, the assumption that a species without a long history of interstellar warfare could not possibly present a serious military challenge to anyone. I think of how completely, how thoroughly, that assumption has just been dismantled in the space of a single engagement against 3 raiders, who, by every measure the Coalition uses to assess threats, should have posed no real challenge to a lone vessel, operating without support. "There is more," I say, pulling up another section of the old envoy's report, one I nearly skipped past the first time through. The envoy mentions rumors, unconfirmed at the time, about conflicts fought among humans themselves before they ever achieved unified spacefaring status. Descriptions of engagements where distance was treated less as an advantage to be maintained and more as an obstacle to be endured only long enough to close it completely. You believe this reflects something deeper than a single ship's design philosophy, Vashtor says. I believe, I say carefully, choosing my words because I am not yet certain how far to trust the conclusion forming in my mind, that we may have just witnessed a single example of a doctrine that runs through their entire species. Not an isolated design choice made by one shipbuilder for one vessel, but a philosophy so deeply embedded in how humans think about conflict that it shapes everything they build, from the ship in front of us to whatever else their fleets might include, that we have never had reason to examine closely before today. The human vessel completes its approach, coming to rest alongside our own crippled hull with a precision that speaks to exactly the same controlled confidence I watched it demonstrate throughout the entire engagement with the raiders. I watch on my display as docking clamps extend, aligning with our own emergency access points as though whoever designed this procedure had studied our ship's specifications in advance, though I know that cannot be the case given how quickly this entire encounter unfolded. They intend to dock, I report, though the observation feels almost unnecessary given how clearly the intention shows on my display. Vashtor straightens, smoothing the front of his uniform in a gesture I recognize as an attempt to compose himself before whatever comes next. Then we will meet them properly, he says, and perhaps begin to understand exactly what kind of ally, or threat, we have found ourselves indebted to today. I follow him from the bridge, my mind still turning over everything the old envoy's report described, everything I have witnessed with my own instruments over the course of this engagement, and underneath all of it, a single thought that refuses to settle no matter how many times I try to set it aside. If a single human vessel, acting alone and without any apparent difficulty, was capable of neutralizing 3 armed raiders that had already crippled a coalition cruiser, then the old assumptions the coalition has carried about humanity's place in the balance of power across known space were never simply outdated. They were dangerously, catastrophically wrong, and I suspect that realization is only now beginning to spread beyond the walls of this single damaged ship. As we make our way toward the docking bay where our unexpected rescuers wait, I find myself glancing back toward the viewport one final time, toward the 3 disabled raider vessels still drifting silently in the dark beyond our hull, stripped of everything that once made them a threat by an opponent who never needed distance to accomplish what an entire coalition fleet might have struggled to manage in a fair, standard engagement. Whatever comes next, I suspect the story of what happened here today will travel far beyond this single sector, and I am not certain the rest of the coalition is prepared for what it will find when it finally arrives. The docking bay doors cycle open with a hiss of equalizing pressure, and I stand beside Vashtor as the first of our unexpected rescuers steps through onto our deck. I do not know what I expected. Perhaps something imposing, some outward sign of the capability I watched demonstrated so thoroughly only a short while ago. What I find instead is a man of average height, dressed in a simple, functional uniform without the elaborate markings coalition officers typically wear to denote rank and achievement, his expression calm in a way that somehow unsettles me more than open aggression ever could. Commander Elias Voss, he says, offering the introduction plainly, without ceremony. Widow's Reach, I understand you sent out a call for help. Vashtor straightens to his full height, and I can see him searching for the right words, caught between the formal gratitude protocol demands and the unease still visible just beneath his composed exterior. Vashtor Kell, commanding officer of the Ashen Vigil. You have my thanks, Commander. And my curiosity. A faint, brief smile crosses Voss's face, there and gone so quickly I almost miss it. I imagine you have quite a few questions. Behind him, a second figure enters the docking bay, a woman with short, practical hair and the same unadorned uniform as Voss, carrying a medical kit slung over one shoulder. She introduces herself simply as Clara Bennett, ship's medical officer, and moves past us without waiting for further instruction, already heading toward the corridor where our injured crew members have been gathered for treatment. There is no hesitation in her movement, no need for guidance through an unfamiliar ship, as though she had already studied our internal layout before ever setting foot aboard. "Your medical officer seems to know her way around our vessel already," I observe. "We pulled your ship's schematics from the distress signal," Voss explains, as though this were the most ordinary thing in the world. "Standard procedure. We like to know where we are walking before we walk there." I file the detail away alongside everything else I have observed today, another small piece of evidence pointing toward a level of preparation and discipline that sits uncomfortably alongside the reckless courage I witnessed during the engagement with the raiders. This is not a crew operating on instinct alone. Every action, from the ship's initial approach to this quiet, efficient docking procedure, appears to reflect careful planning, executed with a confidence that assumes success rather than merely hoping for it. "May I ask you something directly, Commander?" Vashtor says, and I recognize the careful tone he uses when he intends to press a point he considers important. "Your vessel approached 3 hostile ships without deploying long-range weapons, absorbed sustained fire without retreating, and only engaged once the distance had closed to what I would consider an extraordinarily dangerous range. I would like to understand why." Voss considers the question for a moment, and when he answers, his tone carries none of the boastfulness I might have expected from someone justifying such an unconventional approach. "We do not really build for range," he says simply. "Never needed to, historically speaking. Our weapons, our ships, even the way we train our crews, all of it assumes the fight is going to end up close eventually, one way or another, so we design for that moment instead of trying to avoid it." "Even against 3 armed vessels simultaneously," Vashtor presses. "Especially then," Voss says, and there is something almost apologetic in the way he says it, as though he understands how strange this philosophy must sound to someone raised on an entirely different set of assumptions. Range favors whoever has the advantage in numbers or firepower from a distance. Closing that gap levels things out fast, if your equipment and your people are built for what happens next. I watch Vashtor absorb this explanation, and I can see him testing it against everything he witnessed during the engagement, searching for the flaw in the logic that would restore some sense of order to a doctrine that otherwise contradicts everything the Coalition has ever taught him about warfare. He does not find one, and I suspect that troubles him more than any weakness in the reasoning would have. "Your species has never encountered a true test of this philosophy against a peer-level military force," Vashtor says slowly. "The raiders we face today, while dangerous, do not represent the full capability of coalition or hostile forces operating throughout this sector." Voss nods, unbothered by the observation. "That is a fair point, Commander. We have not fought a war against anyone in this region of space, and I would be lying if I claimed to know exactly how our approach would hold up against a force built and trained to a different standard entirely. But I will say this much. We did not build our fleet expecting to never be tested. We built it expecting exactly the opposite." The quiet confidence in his voice leaves an impression on me that lingers long after the conversation moves on to more practical matters. The logistics of repairing our damaged hull, arrangements for transferring the restrained raider crews into Coalition custody, the small, ordinary details that follow any crisis once the immediate danger has passed. Throughout all of it, Voss and his crew conduct themselves with the same understated efficiency I observed during the engagement itself, offering assistance without demanding gratitude, providing information without embellishment, treating the entire encounter as though it were simply another day's work, rather than an extraordinary demonstration of capability that has, in the span of a single engagement, overturned assumptions the Coalition has held for generations. Later, once the immediate crisis has settled and our own crew has begun the slow process of repairing what damage can be repaired, I find Vashtor standing alone near the observation deck, watching the Widows reach through the viewport as it maintains position alongside our own battered hull. "What troubles you, Commander?" I ask, though I suspect I already know the answer. "We have spent decades measuring humanity by an incomplete standard," he says quietly, without turning from the viewport. "A young species, capable enough for trade, not yet worth serious consideration as a military power. I wonder now how much of that assessment was ever accurate, and how much of it was simply comfortable." "Comfortable in what sense?" I ask. "Comfortable because it did not require us to imagine what an entire fleet built along the principles we witness today might be capable of," he says. One ship dismantled 3 armed raiders without appearing to strain itself in the process. I find myself wondering what happens if humanity ever decides that isolation no longer serves their interests. What happens when they stop staying quietly within their own 3 systems and begin looking outward the way every other spacefaring power in this sector eventually has? I do not have an answer for him, and I do not think anyone within the coalition truly does yet. What I do know, standing beside him and watching the Widow's Reach hold its steady, patient position alongside our crippled ship, is that the encounter we survived today was never simply a rescue. It was a glimpse, however brief and however limited in scope, into a set of assumptions about strength and safety that the rest of known space has never had reason to seriously consider before, and I suspect that glimpse will not be easily forgotten by anyone who witnessed it firsthand. The debt is paid, I say quietly, more to fill the silence than because I believe the words carry any real comfort. Whatever else this means, they saved our ship and our crew without asking for anything in return. Vashtor is quiet for a long moment before he finally responds, his gaze still fixed on the human vessel beyond the viewport. Yes, he says, the debt is paid, but I do not think the truth we learned today is going anywhere, Drevik. I think it is only just beginning to spread. 3 days later, once the Ashen Vigil has been stabilized enough to limp toward the nearest Coalition repair station under its own power, I sit at my station and compile the official sensor logs from the engagement into a formal report for Coalition High Command. It is not a task I look forward to. I have filed enough reports over the years to understand exactly how this one will be received, filtered through the same comfortable assumptions about humanity that Vashtor and I spent so much time examining in the days following our rescue. I include everything anyway: the precise timestamps of the human vessel's approach, the complete absence of long-range weapons fire until the distance had closed to what any coalition tactician would consider a catastrophically dangerous range, the shield readings that held steady under sustained fire from 3 separate hostile vessels, the boarding action that neutralized each raider ship in turn, without the widespread loss I would have expected from a coalition force attempting the same maneuver. I attached the old envoy's report as well, the one describing humanity's evolutionary history, and the unusual relationship with distance and danger that history appears to have produced, though I suspect few officers reviewing my submission will bother reading that far into the supporting material. I already know, before I even submit the file, that some analyst several levels removed from this engagement will mark it as an outlier, an unusual result produced by underprepared raiders, rather than evidence of anything systemic about human military doctrine. It is the same pattern every previous human encounter report has followed, according to the archives I searched during my research. Dismissed, filed away, treated as an interesting curiosity, rather than a serious data point worth reconsidering established assumptions over. This time, though, something is different. Word of the engagement spreads faster than any official report could account for, carried not through formal channels but through the informal networks that exist among coalition crews, scattered across this sector, the kind of story that gets passed from one ship's mess hall to another, whenever vessels cross paths at a supply station or repair dock. By the time the Ashen Vigil reaches the repair station 3 weeks later, I find that several other officers have already heard some version of what happened to us, each retelling slightly different from the last, but all of them circling the same central, uncomfortable truth. A single human vessel, without support, dismantled 3 armed raiders that had already crippled a coalition cruiser, and it did so by embracing exactly the kind of close-range engagement every coalition doctrine treats as a last resort, rather than a deliberate strategy. I meet with several officers from other vessels during our stay at the repair station, and I notice a pattern emerging in these conversations that I did not expect. Where once any mention of humanity's military potential would have been met with polite dismissal or outright amusement, I now find officers listening more carefully, asking more detailed questions, requesting copies of whatever sensor data I am willing to share. A tactical officer from a Shrath cruiser docked alongside us spends nearly an hour reviewing my logs, her expression growing more serious with each passing minute, before finally admitting that her own ship's weapons doctrine has never accounted for an enemy willing to absorb sustained fire simply to close the distance completely. We build for range because range has always kept us safe, she tells me, echoing almost exactly the same words Vashtor used during our own conversation weeks earlier. I am beginning to understand that this assumption may only hold true against enemies who share it. I hear variations of this same realization repeated across the repair station over the following days. Quiet conversations among officers who have spent their entire careers trained to believe that distance equals control, now grappling with evidence that an entire species may have built its military philosophy around the opposite premise entirely. Some dismiss the concern as overblown, pointing out correctly that humanity remains isolationist, confined largely to its own small cluster of systems with no apparent ambition toward expansion. Others, and I find myself increasingly among their number, wonder how long that isolation is likely to last, and what the rest of known space will do if humanity ever decides its own borders are no longer sufficient. I think often, during those quiet weeks at the repair station, about my final conversation with Vashtor before we parted ways, him returning to active duty aboard a newly assigned vessel, while I await reassignment following the Ashen Vigil's extended repairs. He told me, in a rare moment of open reflection, that he no longer feels entirely safe simply because he happens to be far away from any potential threat. For his entire career, distance has represented safety, the fundamental principle underlying every tactical decision he has ever made. Now, having witnessed firsthand what happens when that principle meets an opponent who never accepted it as true, he finds himself uncertain whether the safety he always believed distance provided was ever as reliable as he assumed. I share that uncertainty now, more than I would have imagined possible before this entire encounter began. I think about Commander Voss, standing calmly in our docking bay, as though neutralizing 3 armed raiders without long-range weapons were simply an ordinary part of his job. I think about the boarding teams moving through hostile compartments with quiet, controlled efficiency, restraining rather than eliminating wherever possible, demonstrating a level of discipline that suggests this approach to warfare is not simply reckless courage, but a carefully honed doctrine refined over generations of practice, even if that practice occurred entirely on a single world before humanity ever reached the stars. Somewhere out among the stars, beyond the borders humanity has kept to so carefully during the short years since Coalition contact began, more vessels like the Widow's Reach are surely being built, crewed by people trained in the same philosophy, equipped with the same understanding that distance is not a guarantee of safety but simply another variable to be managed and, when necessary, discarded entirely in pursuit of a decisive outcome. I do not know when, or if, humanity will ever choose to look beyond its own small cluster of systems with anything resembling ambition. I do not know whether the isolationist stance the Coalition has always found so reassuring will hold indefinitely, or whether it represents nothing more than a temporary pause before something larger begins. What I do know, filing my final addendum to the official report before finally closing the file for good, is that I no longer take comfort in distance the way I once did. Every ship I encounter now, Coalition or otherwise, earns a closer inspection from my station than it once would have. A quiet, private habit, born from 3 days aboard a crippled cruiser, watching every assumption I ever held about safety and warfare come apart in the space of a single engagement. The galaxy, I suspect, is only beginning to understand what it witnessed that day, and I find myself wondering, more often than I would like to admit, what happens next once the rest of known space finally catches up to what a handful of us learned firsthand, drifting helpless in the dark, waiting for a rescue we never expected to survive.